Welcome to Pathfinding. Hello, and welcome to another Pathfinding talk. Now, last week, I gave a talk on life and death, meaning a kind of analysis of things which lead us to life and things which lead us to death. Not necessarily end of life, but things that enhance us and detriment. And today's talk is called The Psychology of Pleasure and Pain. And if I can just recap what I talked about last week, because this week is kind of a sister talk. So last week we had 4 phrases: life which feels like life, life which feels like death, death which feels like death, and death which feels like life. The idea was that we're not just talking about when things die or when they're alive, but when, in a final sense, but things that enhance our life or our relationships or our projects, and things that are detrimental to them, and the way we perceive them. So we talked about how some things which can be good for you can also feel good. So it's like a confirmation feeling just in your whole instinct and your whole being. You feel this is good for me. A simple example of that, as I said last week, is somebody comes home very tired, worked hard all day, I've been very productive. They make a very nutritious, lovely meal, the right proportion, the right time of day to eat it, and they eat it and it just feels great and it's good for them. And then life which feels like death is something which would feel bad if you're out of shape and you have to exercise, or if you're way overweight and you have to diet. You feel like you're being diminished, but it's good for you. And death, which feels like death, is something that's bad for you and feels bad when you experience it. So at least you know what's going on. And death, which feels like life, is something that's bad for you, all your relationships, all your projects, and it feels like life, so it's confusing. And so today's talk is introducing some tools to help navigate this. And that's why, in a way, we're going to be talking about 2 kinds of pleasure and 2 kinds of pain. And so the first one is a tool I came up with. Actually, it may sound trivial, but I've had a lifetime struggle with an addiction to sweets. Not really a smoker, drinker, definitely not interested in drugs. But if you eat a lot of sweets, and if it's a real addiction, it can be just as damaging as other things, even though it seems like a cute thing to be addicted to. It can lead to lethargy. Honestly, I sleep 12 hours a day when I eat too much sweets, and it could even lead to diabetes and ill health and death. So actually, it is a serious thing, but because it's something that I've always struggled with, I just love sweets. The only way I can really control my addiction to sweets, my craving for sweets, is to abstain completely. Because even if I have a little bit of chocolate bar here or a cookie there, I just want more and more and more. And I feel this desire just taking over me sometimes. And especially if I feel a bit low and I want some comfort eating, then I feel a struggle. So this is how I developed an understanding and a tool and a visual tool, a mental tool of looking at pleasure and pain and how it helps. So in life in general, we want the greatest pleasure. If you have an option of 2 types of pleasure, you want the greatest pleasure. And if possible, we want to be here, right? If you have to suffer, if you have to feel some pain from something, we want to feel the least option of pain. So we want most pleasure we can get, good kind of pleasure that's also good for us, and the least pain. So we're not talking about kind of an illicit or damaging pleasure where it's something that's bad for you but feels good. No, we're not talking about hedonistic pleasure. We're just talking about in general. Instead of pleasure, you could use the word well-being or happiness. So we want the most pleasure and we want the least pain. That's our objective. So when I go into a shop and I feel this craving to buy sweets, and I know what's going to happen, I'm going to tell myself that I'm going to buy some sweets just for today. I'm going to have a cheat day. But the next day I'll think, well, just a second day won't be such a problem. Next thing I know, I'm just gorging on sweets for days and weeks sometimes. And my whole life becomes, it has a detrimental effect on my life, and I become lethargic and unproductive. But you can transplant this idea to anything. It could be something really dangerous like drugs, or it could be somebody who's addicted to anger or laziness. It could be anything which is good for you and bad for you. And so what I do when I face with that temptation, what happens is your emotion, your desire is strongly pushing you to fulfill itself. And so it starts to erode your logic and your thinking. You know what's good for you and what's not good for you. But when emotion is there, emotion sometimes acts like a gravitational force which distorts logic. It starts to bend logic to it. And so you start to even make justifications in your own mind. And so when I'm in that situation, I remind myself, okay, I want the maximum pleasure. Now, I can either have a momentary pleasure of eating the sweets, or I can have the long-lasting pleasure of good health. And it's not just a nebulous concept, good health. When you're eating healthy and exercising, you definitely feel more alive, and you get more enjoyment from everything in life, and you feel more vital. You really do feel more alive. And it's a no-brainer, really, when you compare the two, the pleasure of eating sweets or doing whatever it is you do that's detrimental to you. Compare that to the pleasure of having long-lasting health. If you can remind yourself, which is how I help myself fight the battle to get self-control and self-discipline, if you can remind yourself that, yes, doing this will give me a momentary pleasure, but the long-lasting pleasure of good health far outweighs the pleasure I'd get from whatever activity, in my case, eating sweets. And at the same time, because we want the least pain, we can remind ourselves, in my scenario, we can remind ourselves that if I eat sweets, I'm going to get pain in ill health and lethargy and maybe diabetes, rotting teeth, ongoing. And if I deny myself to eat the sweets, yes, I'm going to feel some pain. It's going to be the pain of self-denial. Let's not marginalize it. Let's not minimize it. It's difficult to endure. That's why we came into it so much. But if I visualize it juxtaposed with the pain of giving into the desire for sweets, we can see clearly that the pain of self-denial is less. And because I want the less pain, not the greater pain, it somehow helps me to remind myself of what I want. And so this is the tool, the visual tool I created to help me, to help you in any situation where you just feel that moment of temptation. Because in the beginning, when we set a determination, right, I'm going to exercise every day, or I'm going to pray every day, or I'm going to eat healthy. In the beginning, we have lots of willpower and enthusiasm. But every time we get hit by the price we have to pay for that self-discipline, where we have to suffer a little bit, we have to go without, our will and our resolve starts to diminish, doesn't it? And there's a reason for that, and I'm going to be giving a whole talk about that too. The brief of that is that willpower is like an engine, but it's a mistake to think that we can just intellectually just tell our engine to work willpower. Willpower needs fuel. The engine needs fuel, and the fuel is actually emotion. And the way we generate emotion is by engaging intellectually with the topic. We visualize the things, and we visualize the benefits we're going to have. And when we get hope, and hope translates into emotion. And so as long as we do that, we have fuel for the willpower. So that's why when we remind ourselves of not only the greater pleasure of good health, but warn ourselves of the greater danger of ill health. That pain is worse than the pain of self-denial. And that's why people will go to Alcoholics Anonymous, or do they call it Drugs Anonymous, or even anger management classes. They go there so they can remind themselves, and they can hear stories of others. Because if they just say, look, I'm not supposed to engage in that behavior, and I'm going to try, but they don't think about it. They don't remind themselves what the benefit is, what the risk benefit and the cost benefit. So after a while, just the desire starts to be resident in their mind, and the thoughts about what's the best way starts to get diminished and degraded and disappear. So they go to these meetings and they hear testimonies from other people and they give their own testimony. And they come out of that meeting with regenerated hope for the next few days or next few weeks, where they can continue to make effort. But there is a problem. Even if we have this tool, we have this sense of what is the greater pleasure, what is the greater benefit, and what is the greater cost that we'll have to pay if we don't control ourselves. And that is one of perspective. Now, we all know that if you're on a road and you see a house hundreds of yards, hundreds of meters down the road, it could look smaller than the car you're in, even though it's way, way bigger. That's how perspective works. But perspective also has an effect on our vision, our roadmap for our own life. So, for example, in this image here, we can see blue is the symbol, as you saw on the scales thing, of the greater pleasure. But when the pleasure is deferred, so for example, the pleasure of good health by not eating junk food, when that is deferred to the mid and long term, weeks, months, even years down the line, compared to the pleasure of eating the sweets now, actually, the pleasure of eating the sweets now can create an illusion in your mind that it's actually it's a greater pleasure than the pleasure, even though the actual amount of, if you take the aggregate pleasure of having great health and vitality every single day, months and years, it far outweighs the short-term pleasure of whatever it is you're doing that's detrimental to you. But it can have a psychological impact on you. So it's a secondary tool I created just to remind that even though it feels like a greater pleasure now, it's actually a far lesser pleasure. And it's not worth sacrificing that greater pleasure of medium to long-term health and well-being for this pleasure. And the same is true with pain. So actually, the pain of self-denial is actually far smaller and less, and far outweighed by the pain of ill health and being lethargic and having no vitality. And so but the pain of ill health is a little bit deferred. You eat junk food a lot every day, but it could take some time, weeks and months even, for it to manifest in the bad health and just feeling down. But the pain of denying the pleasurable junk food is immediate. And so again, because of perspective, it creates an illusion that it's a greater pain when it's actually a lesser pain. So this is a good tool, I find, to visualize this. And yeah, so this is our objective. We want the greatest pleasure and the least pain. But because of the perspective issue, it creates the illusion that the short-term immediacy of doing something gives us greater pleasure. So we remind ourselves that actually, in the long term, this is greater pleasure. And the same with the pain. This pain is actually less. That self-denial pain is actually less, but it creates the illusion that it's everything, and it's far greater than the pain of ill health. But actually, the pain of self-denial is almost nothing compared to the pain of ill health. So yeah, this is a tool that I use, and this is how it's like a sister talk to the previous talk where I talked about, if I can just zoom back to this slide, where I talked about life which feels like life which feels like death. Because when we think about those things, it's not always easy to tell which is which. So something feels great, like in this case, you do something that really feels great and it's good for you. Or you could be doing something that feels great, but it's killing you. And so I find those tools, and it's the same with you do something which feels horrible, like working out when you haven't worked out for a long time, and it feels like death, but it's good for you. Or you do something which is horrible, and it is horrible. So it's good to understand which of those things, the greater pain and the greater pleasure, are relevant. So anyway, that's just a tool that I use to try to understand. Let me just maybe go to these so to illustrate it at the end. And yeah, as I said, self-discipline is not an easy thing to develop, but it is something that we can actually engineer. There are actually tools and practices that we can engage in which will increase our self-discipline. As I said, reminding ourselves about the benefit of something is a way to generate emotion which powers our will. And so if we just decide, oh, I need to live this certain way, but we don't remind ourselves of the benefit of doing it regularly, then we can sort of run out of willpower. That's why a lot of people resolve to give up smoking, drinking, or to diet or to exercise in the beginning because they've suffered the ill effects of their bad behavior. They might have a strong willpower. I'm so sick of feeling like this. I want to improve. So in the beginning, there's a big reservoir of desire, which pushes the engine of willpower. But every time they have to suffer to reach their goal, the fuel gets used up, actually. So it's that desire that enables them to endure the difficulty of making that effort. But it's not an unlimited supply, it gets used up. And so there are tools about how to generate that desire as we go on, because the initial supply of desire might not be enough to get us all the way to the end. I think smoking is a good example because when people give up smoking, I actually started smoking when I was 12 and I quit when I was 19. But when people give up smoking, there's a duration where they have to suffer. And then just the spell is broken at a certain point. But if they only have enough desire to endure that difficulty and that pain, that withdrawal for half the time or 2/3 of the time, then often what happens is when they run out of desire to improve, they fall back into the habit, they give into it. So sometimes you start out with enough fuel to get you there half the way, 2/3 of the way, but we need to learn certain practices to regenerate more fuel as we go along so we can get all the way. So yeah, this is about self-engineering, about self-development. And so I think, yeah, I'll give a talk about how to regenerate that fuel, perhaps next. And thanks for listening and watching. And if you want to check out pathfinding on Twitter, it's path__finding. I'll link it in the notes. And also we're on Rumble and we're on YouTube. So please subscribe and keep checking in. And we've got lots more talks to give. Thanks very much.